In the chamber of Ghana's parliament, something unusual happened. The familiar image of dark Western suits and silk ties disappeared. In their place stood rows of lawmakers wearing the fugu, a traditional woven garment from northern Ghana. This was not a festival, and it was not a cultural performance. It was a deliberate political statement. By choosing the fugu over the Western suit, Ghana's lawmakers were not changing fashion. They were challenging a long-standing idea about power, dignity, and identity in Africa. The immediate trigger came from outside Ghana. During a state visit to Zambia, President John Dramani Mahama arrived wearing a ceremonial fugu. On social media, some voices mocked the outfit, calling it inappropriate and questioning why an African head of state would not wear a Western suit. What followed in Ghana was swift and united. Members of parliament from different political parties responded together. They appeared in parliament wearing the same traditional garment, sending a clear message that African identity does not need permission to exist. This moment, often called the smock parliament, carried deeper meaning. It showed that clothing in African politics is never neutral. The Western suit, inherited from colonial rule, has long been treated as the default symbol of seriousness and authority. By rejecting it, even for a single day, Ghana's parliament reversed that hierarchy. They declared that African tradition is not informal, backward, or symbolic only during celebrations. It is fully capable of representing the state. The choice of the fugu was especially powerful. Historically, it was worn by warriors and leaders. It represents courage, discipline, and honor. When lawmakers wore it together, they transformed a social media insult into a national affirmation. Ghana reminded the world that dignity does not come from imported symbols. It comes from knowing who you are. Yet this powerful moment also invites a broader reflection. While Ghana made headlines, another African country had already gone much further. Burkina Faso had quietly begun turning tradition into policy, not just symbolism. This difference marks two paths toward the same goal, reclaiming African identity from the shadow of Western norms. To understand why the fugu carries such political weight, one must look beyond its appearance and into its history. The fugu is not simply a traditional garment. It is a symbol shaped by centuries of life, conflict, and leadership in northern Ghana, long before modern borders and parliaments existed. This garment already carried meaning tied to authority and survival. The fugu originates from the northern regions of Ghana, among communities such as the Dagomba, Mamprusi, and Gonja. It was traditionally worn by warriors, chiefs, and elders. The thick cotton fabric, hand-woven in narrow strips and carefully stitched together, was designed for durability. Its wide and flowing form allowed freedom of movement, especially for men on horseback, in times of war. It was common for protective charms to be sewn into the garment, giving it both practical and spiritual significance. Beyond warfare, the fugu also represented status. The detailed embroidery around the neckline was never random. Patterns and symbols often reflected rank, experience, or leadership. To wear such a garment was to be recognized as someone with responsibility and honor within the community. In this sense, the fugu was an early form of political language, communicating authority without words. Its transition from regional tradition to national symbol came at a defining moment in African history. In 1957, when Ghana declared independence from British colonial rule, Kwame Nkrumah chose to wear the fugu. This was a deliberate act. By rejecting the colonial suit at the moment of independence, Nkrumah sent a clear message: political freedom must be accompanied by cultural dignity. Ghana would not simply change rulers. It would reclaim its own image. That moment elevated the fugu from a northern garment to a national emblem of resistance and self-determination. When Ghana's lawmakers wore it decades later in Parliament, they were not inventing a new symbol. They were reviving an old one. The fugu once again became what it had always been, the clothing of those who lead, protect, and define their people. For decades, the Western suit has been treated as the natural uniform of power in Africa. In parliaments, ministries, courts, and diplomatic meetings, the suit and tie became symbols of seriousness, competence, and modern governance. Yet this image did not emerge organically from African societies. It was inherited from colonial rule and quietly preserved long after independence. During the colonial era, European administrators imposed not only political systems, but also visual standards of authority. To look powerful was to look European. After independence, many African states changed leaders and flags, but the appearance of power remained largely the same. The suit survived as an unchallenged symbol, while traditional clothing was pushed to the margins, reserved for festivals, villages, or cultural displays. Over time, a false equation took root. Western dress meant modern. African dress meant traditional and therefore informal. This hierarchy created a deep contradiction. African leaders governed African societies while dressed in symbols that did not originate from African history. Authority was expressed through borrowed images, reinforcing the idea that legitimacy still flowed from the former colonial center. Even today, when an African leader appears in traditional clothing on the international stage, it is often described as unusual, symbolic, or even inappropriate. When the same leader wears a suit, no explanation is required. The reaction to President Mahama's fugu in Zambia exposed this imbalance. The mockery was not really about clothing, it was about expectations. Many observers unconsciously expected a head of state to look Western in order to be taken seriously. Ghana's parliamentary response directly challenged that assumption by rejecting the suit inside the nation's highest legislative body. Lawmakers questioned why African power should continue to dress itself in foreign symbols. This was not a rejection of modernity. It was a rejection of imitation. Ghana's message was clear. Modern governance does not depend on fabric imported from Europe. It depends on legitimacy, unity, and self-respect. When African institutions choose their own symbols of authority, they begin to free themselves from the invisible chains of colonial standards. While Ghana's parliament drew global attention with a single, powerful gesture, Burkina Faso had already been moving in a quieter but more systematic direction. Long before the smock parliament made headlines, Burkina Faso began redefining how authority looks by placing traditional clothing at the center of state life. This was not driven by public controversy or external mockery. It was driven by political vision. In Burkina Faso, traditional textiles such as faso danfani have increasingly appeared in the daily image of government. Senior officials, ministers, and state representatives regularly wear locally produced garments during official duties. Over time, this practice stopped being remarkable. It became normal. Authority no longer required a Western suit to appear legitimate. The most significant step came in the justice system. Courts represent one of the most formal and symbolic spaces of state power. By introducing judicial attire made from faso danfani, Burkina Faso directly challenged one of the strongest colonial legacies. Instead of robes modeled on European traditions, judges and court officials began wearing garments rooted in local culture. This shift sent a clear message. Justice in Burkina Faso is administered in the name of the people, not inherited forms from a foreign past. Importantly, this change was not framed as nostalgia or rejection of law. Legal procedures, institutions, and professional standards remained intact. What changed was the visual language of authority. The state demonstrated that African culture could carry the same seriousness and legitimacy as any imported symbol. Burkina Faso's approach shows a different path from Ghana's. There was no single dramatic moment. There was no sudden protest or viral reaction. Instead, tradition was woven steadily into institutions until it became part of the system itself. This is what makes Burkina Faso stand out. It moved beyond symbolism and turned cultural pride into policy. In doing so, it quietly redefined what a modern African state can look like. Placing Ghana and Burkina Faso side by side reveals two different strategies built around the same desire. Both countries seek to reclaim African dignity from inherited Western norms. Yet, they move at different speeds and through different methods. One acts through a powerful moment. The other builds through steady transformation. Ghana's approach was dramatic and highly visible. The smock parliament was a single event, but it carried enormous symbolic force. It showed unity across political lines and turned public attention toward a deeper conversation about identity. In Ghana's case, tradition entered the political space as a response. It was activated by an external challenge and transformed into a collective statement. The strength of this approach lies in its ability to mobilize society quickly and capture global attention. Burkina Faso followed another path. There was no single day when everyone noticed a sudden change. Instead, traditional clothing gradually became part of official life. Ministers wore it. State ceremonies featured it. Courts adopted it. Over time, the image of authority itself changed. What began as encouragement became expectation. What was once symbolic became structural. This contrast highlights an important distinction. Ghana demonstrated the power of symbolism. Burkina Faso demonstrated the power of normalization. One says, "We remember who we are." The other says, "This is now who we are." Both messages are valuable, but they operate on different timelines. Ghana's gesture challenged perception. Burkina Faso's policy reshaped behavior. In Ghana, tradition entered parliament as a statement. In Burkina Faso, it entered institutions as a rule of practice. This makes Burkina's transformation more durable, while Ghana's moment remains emotionally potent. Together, these two paths show that reclaiming identity does not require a single formula. A nation can begin with a symbolic stand or with institutional reform. What matters is direction. In both cases, the message is the same. African authority does not need Western clothing to appear legitimate. It only needs confidence in its own foundations. Fugu. Leadership plays a decisive role in how symbols gain meaning. In the case of Ghana and Burkina Faso, two leaders illustrate two different ways culture can influence power. President John Dramani Mahama and President Ibrahim Traore both placed traditional clothing at the center of political identity. But their methods and impact were distinct. John Dramani Mahama's influence came through personal example. By wearing the fugu during an official visit abroad, he did not announce a policy or issue an order. Instead, he made a visible choice. That choice challenged expectations and reopened a national conversation about dignity. Mahama's action reminded Ghanaians of an older tradition, one associated with Kwame Nkrumah and the moment of independence. His role was catalytic. He did not institutionalize change, but he ignited it. The response from Parliament showed how a symbolic act by a leader can mobilize institutions without formal instruction. Ibrahim Traore represents a different model. As a revolutionary leader, he approached culture as a structural element of the state. Under his leadership, traditional clothing did not remain a personal preference. It became a repeated, visible feature of governance. Ministers, officials, and judges adopted locally produced garments as part of their professional identity. This was not about reaction or debate. It was about construction. Traore treated symbols as tools for rebuilding national confidence after years of instability. The contrast is revealing. Mahama acted as a messenger of memory. Traore acted as an architect of transformation. One recalled what had been forgotten. The other reorganized how power is displayed. Yet both leaders shared a common belief. Political authority in Africa must rest on African foundations. Together, their examples show that leadership does not require the same strategy to reach the same destination. Whether through a single symbolic act or a long-term structural shift, leaders shape how nations see themselves. In both Ghana and Burkina Faso, traditional clothing became more than fabric. It became a language of leadership. The reactions surrounding Ghana's smock parliament reveal a deeper truth about power and perception. Outside Africa, many observers still judge authority through Western standards. A suit is seen as normal. African clothing is seen as a statement. This imbalance explains why traditional dress attracts attention, mockery, or surprise, while Western dress passes without comment. It also explains why moments like Ghana's parliamentary gesture matter far beyond fashion. Ghana showed how a symbolic act can unite a nation. By standing together in fugu, lawmakers reminded the world that African identity is not decorative. It is political. It carries history, struggle, and pride. That single day in Parliament demonstrated that dignity does not depend on imitation. It depends on self-recognition. Burkina Faso, however, offers a lesson of another kind. By steadily integrating traditional clothing into government and the justice system, it proved that culture can become structure. What Ghana expressed through a moment, Burkina Faso built into daily practice. One path awakens memory, the other reshapes institutions. Together, they show a direction for the continent. The lesson for Africa is clear. Modernity does not require abandoning tradition. Sovereignty is incomplete if it exists only in laws and borders but not in symbols. Clothing may seem simple, but it reflects how a nation sees itself and how it wishes to be seen. As Africa continues to redefine its place in the world, the choice of symbols will matter more than ever. The question is no longer whether African leaders should look Western to be respected. The question is whether Africa is ready to fully respect itself. Ghana and Burkina Faso suggest that the answer is already taking shape, woven in fabric, history, and confidence.